It was a routine flight, nothing out of the ordinary, just another day for Sarah as she settled into her seat, preparing for the journey ahead. She was on her way to visit her family, something she'd done countless times before. The hum of the airplane engines and the soft chatter of passengers created a familiar background noise that allowed her to relax momentarily. But this time, something felt off. She couldn't quite place it, but there was an underlying sense of unease. It wasn't the turbulence or even the flight delay that had happened earlier in the day. This felt different. As the plane reached cruising altitude and the flight attendants began their usual rounds, Sarah caught herself glancing nervously at the other passengers. Her fingers absent-mindedly fidgeted with the edge of her sweater, her eyes darting around the cabin. It was as if she was expecting something to happen, but even she didn't know what. Across the aisle, a man in his mid-40s had been eyeing her ever since she'd boarded. He hadn't said anything, hadn't made any overt gestures, but his gaze was unsettling. Sarah tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself she was just being paranoid. She leaned back in her seat, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath. The flight attendant walked by with the beverage cart, offering drinks to the passengers. Sarah smiled politely and declined, but the man across the aisle accepted his with an odd smirk. He continued to stare at Sarah, his eyes never leaving her. It was then that she remembered the hand signal she had learned just a few weeks ago from a safety forum online. It was a simple gesture, one that many wouldn't recognize, but it was designed specifically for situations like this, when someone was in danger but couldn't speak openly. She'd never thought she would need to use it. It had seemed more like something theoretical, something you read about but never encounter in real life. But the man's persistent, cold stare made her heart race. He wasn't doing anything overtly threatening, but there was something in his eyes that made Sarah's instincts scream at her to stay alert. As the plane continued to fly smoothly, she tried to distract herself, pulling out her phone to play a game, hoping to ease her rising anxiety. But the tension in her chest only grew worse. She couldn't focus. The man across the aisle shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he leaned forward slightly, still watching her. It was subtle, but it felt like a predator stalking its prey. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. Her palms were sweaty, and she tried to tell herself that she was overreacting, that there was no real danger. But something deep inside her knew better. Her fingers twitched, and without even fully thinking, she made the signal. It was quick, just a flash of her hand as the flight attendant passed her row. Her fingers curled in a specific way, forming the secret signal meant to alert others to danger. She did it so fast that even she wasn't sure if it had been seen, but the flight attendant's eyes flickered with recognition for a split second. And then, everything changed. The flight attendant froze for a moment, her expression blank but tense. She glanced back at Sarah, then over at the man who had been staring at her the entire flight. Her eyes widened slightly, but she remained composed. Sarah could feel her heart beating wildly in her chest. Had she done the right thing? Had the flight attendant understood her signal? What if she'd misjudged the situation? What if there was no real threat, and she had just caused a scene for no reason? But deep down, she knew that something wasn't right. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. The man across the aisle hadn't taken his eyes off her since she'd made the signal, and now there was something more sinister in his gaze. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. There was intent behind those eyes, a dark, calculating look that made Sarah's skin crawl. The flight attendant moved quickly but calmly, whispering something to another member of the crew. Sarah could see them glancing in her direction, their faces tight with concern. She knew she had done the right thing. There was no turning back now. Moments later, the cabin door leading to the cockpit opened, and a second flight attendant emerged, this time with a more serious demeanor. The passengers around Sarah were oblivious to what was happening. They continued chatting or scrolling through their phones, unaware of the growing tension in the air. But Sarah knew something big was about to happen. The man across the aisle shifted again, leaning back in his seat as if he knew something was up. His eyes were still locked on Sarah, But now there was a glint of anger behind them, as if he realized she had somehow betrayed him. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry, as the second flight attendant walked slowly down the aisle, pretending to check the overhead compartments. The plane suddenly felt much smaller, the walls of the cabin closing in around her. Sarah felt trapped, like a cornered animal. Her pulse quickened as she saw the flight attendant stop near her row, exchanging a brief, knowing look with the first attendant. It was a silent communication, but Sarah understood what it meant. The man next to her was dangerous. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Who was this man? What did he want? Had she just alerted the crew in time, or was it already too late? Every instinct in her body told her to remain calm, but she could feel her limbs trembling slightly. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted, but most of the passengers were still blissfully unaware of the unfolding drama. It was as if Sarah and the crew were the only ones trapped in this high-stakes game, with the rest of the world completely oblivious. Suddenly, the man stood up. The flight attendants reacted immediately, moving to intercept him before he could go anywhere. The passengers around them started to notice the commotion, some craning their necks to see what was happening, while others remained lost in their own worlds. Sarah felt a rush of adrenaline surge through her as the situation escalated in front of her eyes. The man glanced around, clearly calculating his next move. His eyes flickered back to Sarah, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw something like recognition, or maybe even regret, in his gaze. But then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by cold determination. In an instant, the situation reached a boiling point. The flight attendants, trained for emergencies, acted swiftly, instructing the man to sit back down. But instead of complying, he lunged forward, his eyes wide with fury. Chaos erupted in the cabin as passengers began to realize something was terribly wrong. Shouts and screams filled the air, but through it all, Sarah remained frozen in her seat, watching as the world around her spiraled into chaos. It was in that moment that Sarah realized her life, and the lives of everyone on that plane, had just changed forever. As the chaos began to unfold around her, Sarah found herself caught in a whirlwind of panic and confusion. The once calm, mundane flight had transformed into a nightmare. The man's sudden outburst, the gasps and shouts from other passengers, and the rushed movements of the flight attendants all merged into one disorienting scene. Her mind raced, struggling to process what was happening as her body remained frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. In the back of her mind, Sarah thought about how her day had started. So normal, so uneventful. Just hours earlier, she had been standing in line at the airport, checking her bag and going through security, completely unaware that her life was about to take a sharp and terrifying turn. She had woken up that morning like she did any other day, her only concern being the trip to visit her family in another city. It had been months since she'd last seen them, and she was looking forward to a weekend away from work and the stresses of her everyday life. But now, those ordinary concerns seemed so distant, so trivial compared to the fear gripping her now. Before the flight, Sarah had gone about her routine without a second thought. She grabbed her usual coffee from the small cafe near her apartment, sent a few texts to her friends, and even scrolled through her social media while waiting to board the plane. Everything felt normal, and she had no reason to think that today would be any different from her past trips. But that sense of safety and normalcy had been shattered the moment she caught that man's unsettling stare from across the aisle. It wasn't just the way he looked at her, it was the persistence, the way his eyes never seemed to leave her. At first, she tried to convince herself that it was nothing. Maybe he was just a strange guy, or maybe she was reading too much into it. After all, people looked at each other on planes all the time. But as the minutes ticked by, and his gaze remained fixed on her, her anxiety began to grow. That's when she remembered the signal. The hand signal was something she had come across by accident just a few weeks earlier. Sarah had been scrolling through an online forum late one night when she stumbled upon a post about personal safety. It was full of advice and tips on what to do if you found yourself in a dangerous situation but couldn't call out for help. One of the tips that caught her eye was a hand signal, a subtle, quick gesture that could alert others to danger without drawing too much attention. It was meant for situations where speaking up might not be an option, but you still needed help. At the time, Sarah had been intrigued but skeptical. She had never imagined she would need to use something like that. Her life was ordinary, predictable. She wasn't the kind of person who found herself in dangerous situations, but something about the signal stuck with her, and for some reason, she remembered it clearly in the moment when she needed it most. As she sat on the plane, the memory of the signal flickered in her mind, and her body reacted before her brain could fully catch up. She made the signal. A simple motion, a curl of her fingers that could mean the difference between safety and danger. At first, she wasn't even sure if the flight attendant had seen it. It happened so quickly, and the flight attendant had been moving down the aisle at the time. But when the attendant froze, her eyes widening slightly as she glanced back at Sarah, Sarah knew that she had been understood. Now, as the man's outburst turned the cabin into a scene of confusion, Sarah's heart raced. She had no idea what was going to happen next, and for a brief moment, she wondered if she had made the right decision. What if she had overreacted? What if this man wasn't as dangerous as she thought? The weight of that uncertainty pressed down on her, but deep inside, she knew that her instincts had been right. There was something off about him, something that had set off alarm bells in her mind. The flight attendants acted quickly, their movements sharp and practiced. They had clearly been trained for emergencies like this, but the tension in their faces betrayed their concern. The man, now standing in the aisle, was shouting something incoherent. His words were lost in the rush of adrenaline that coursed through Sarah's veins, but the tone of his voice was filled with anger and desperation. He made a move to push past the flight attendants, but they stood their ground, trying to calm him down without escalating the situation further. Other passengers were beginning to panic. Some were still sitting in their seats, confused and frightened, while others had started to stand, unsure of what to do. The cabin was filled with the hum of anxious whispers and the sharp crackle of the intercom as the pilot made an announcement, instructing everyone to remain seated. But the man wasn't listening. His eyes, once locked on Sarah, were now darting around the cabin as if searching for a way out. As the flight attendants tried to de-escalate the situation, Sarah's mind kept flashing back to the moment she had first noticed him. It had been subtle, just a glance at first. He hadn't done anything overtly threatening, but there had been something about the way he looked at her that had set her on edge. She remembered his smirk when he accepted his drink from the flight attendant, the way his eyes never seemed to waver from her, as if he was waiting for something. And now, in the midst of the chaos, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this had been building all along. The man was growing more agitated by the second. His shouts grew louder, and his movements became more erratic. He took a step toward one of the flight attendants, who quickly stepped back, holding up her hands in an attempt to calm him. But it wasn't working. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears as she watched the scene unfold, powerless to do anything but sit there and hope that the situation wouldn't spiral further out of control. Then, in an instant, everything seemed to happen at once. The man made a sudden move, lunging toward the back of the plane. He was fast, faster than anyone had anticipated, and for a brief moment, it looked like he might make it past the flight attendants. The passengers around him gasped, some standing up in alarm, while others ducked down in their seats. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat as she watched, fear gripping her so tightly that she could hardly breathe. But before the man could get any further, one of the flight attendants acted. She grabbed him by the arm, her movements swift and decisive. There was a brief struggle, a flurry of movement as the man tried to pull away. But the flight attendants were prepared. They managed to subdue him, pinning him against the side of the cabin, as they called for assistance from the other crew members. It all happened so fast that Sarah could barely process it. In the blink of an eye, the man was restrained, his hands bound as the flight attendants held him down. The other passengers looked on in stunned silence, the shock of what had just happened settling over the cabin like a thick fog. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of heavy breathing and the distant hum of the plane's engines, as everyone tried to make sense of the situation. Sarah sat frozen in her seat, her mind racing. She couldn't believe what had just happened, couldn't believe that just a few minutes ago, everything had seemed so normal. Her day, her flight, her life. Everything had felt routine. But now, in the aftermath of this man's violent outburst, nothing felt certain anymore. The flight attendants, still visibly shaken, began to reassure the passengers, telling them that everything was under control. But Sarah could see the fear in their eyes, the way their hands trembled slightly as they moved. This wasn't something they had expected, and it wasn't something they were likely to forget anytime soon. As the plane continued on its course, Sarah realized that her world had changed in a matter of moments. What had started as an ordinary day had turned into something far more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. And deep down, she knew that this experience would stay with her for the rest of her life. The air in the cabin was thick with tension. Even though the man was now restrained, and the immediate threat seemed to be over, the atmosphere inside the plane felt electric, as if everyone on board was still holding their breath. Sarah could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest, her mind spinning as she tried to process what had just happened. She stared at the restrained man, still in disbelief that only moments ago he had been quietly sitting across the aisle, seemingly just another passenger on an ordinary flight. But now, after the chaos, after her gut-wrenching decision to flash that signal, nothing felt ordinary anymore. Everything felt fragile, as if the entire plane was on the edge of some unseen cliff. Sarah's fingers trembled in her lap as she tried to calm herself. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The man, though he was now physically restrained, hadn't given up. His eyes still burned with that same cold intensity, and he was watching her again, watching her like she was the only thing that mattered in the world. A low murmur had spread throughout the cabin, passengers whispering to one another, casting nervous glances at the restrained man, and at Sarah. It was clear that the other passengers were trying to piece together what had just happened, and why. Some had seen the man's outburst and the flight attendant's quick response, but most hadn't seen the signal she had given, the silent call for help that had set this chain of events in motion. For them, it was all a confusing blur, a sudden disruption in what had otherwise been a normal flight. For Sarah, though, it had been something else entirely. It had been a decision, one she wasn't even sure she had fully made. Her body had acted before her mind could catch up, flashing that hand signal in a moment of instinct, of desperation. She hadn't had time to think about the consequences, hadn't stopped to consider whether the flight attendant would even understand what she was trying to convey. All she knew was that something about the man's behavior had set off alarms in her mind, and she had reacted. But now that the dust was settling, the reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. Sarah's chest tightened as her mind filled with questions. What if she had been wrong? What if the man hadn't been dangerous, and she had caused this whole scene for nothing? She glanced around the cabin, at the flight attendants huddled near the front of the plane, at the other passengers who were still trying to make sense of what had just unfolded. Her heart pounded in her chest as doubt crept into her thoughts. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. She had felt it, something in her gut that told her she wasn't safe. The man's eyes had been too intense, too focused, and his sudden outburst had confirmed her worst fears. Still, the uncertainty gnawed at her. She wasn't a hero, wasn't the type of person who made split-second, life-saving decisions. She was just a regular woman trying to visit her family. And yet, in that moment, she had been forced to make a choice that could have changed everything. As the minutes passed, the tension in the cabin began to shift. The flight attendants were working quickly, trying to calm the passengers, assuring them that everything was under control. The plane would be making an emergency landing at the nearest airport, and authorities would be waiting to deal with the man once they were on the ground. But even though the situation seemed to be stabilizing, Sarah's heart wouldn't stop racing. Every glance from the restrained man sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through her, as if he still had some kind of power over her, even in his helpless state. She remembered how the flight had begun, how normal everything had seemed. The usual routine: boarding the plane, settling into her seat, checking her phone to pass the time. She had watched as the other passengers filtered in, each one just another face in the crowd, none of them standing out. But then there had been the man across the aisle, with his unsettling gaze that seemed to bore into her from the moment he sat down. It wasn't just his stare, it was the way he carried himself, the way he seemed to be watching everything, as if he were waiting for something. Sarah had felt it almost immediately, that creeping sense of unease, but she had pushed it down, telling herself that she was overreacting, that it was nothing. After all, she had no reason to believe she was in danger. She was just another passenger on a routine flight, and people stared sometimes. It was nothing. Except it wasn't nothing. The memory of those moments before the chaos broke out replayed in her mind, and each time, the man's stare felt more sinister, more calculated. He had been watching her for a reason. And when she had made the hand signal, when the flight attendant had seen it and acted, something in the man had shifted. His calm facade had cracked, and the real danger beneath had revealed itself in an instant. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she realized just how close she had come to real danger. If she hadn't remembered that signal, if she hadn't trusted her instincts, what would have happened? The thought made her stomach churn, and she had to take a deep breath to steady herself. She glanced at the flight attendant who had responded to her signal, catching her eye for just a brief moment. There was something in the attendant's expression, a look of gratitude, of understanding, that made Sarah feel like she wasn't alone in this. But the man wasn't done. Even though he was restrained, his presence loomed over the cabin like a dark cloud. He hadn't spoken since his outburst, but his eyes told Sarah everything she needed to know. He wasn't finished. There was something more to this, something that hadn't yet come to light, and that thought terrified her. Suddenly, the plane jolted slightly, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that they would be making an unscheduled landing in just a few minutes. The passengers around Sarah shifted nervously, murmurs of concern spreading through the cabin. Sarah's pulse quickened again. The emergency landing meant that this ordeal was far from over. Whatever had driven the man to act, whatever had prompted him to fixate on her, it hadn't been fully revealed yet. As the plane descended, Sarah felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She had acted out of instinct, and now everything had changed. She could sense the eyes of the other passengers on her, though none of them said anything directly. They didn't know what she had done, or why the man had reacted the way he did, but they could feel the tension radiating from her seat. Sarah tried to keep her head down, but she could feel their curiosity, their silent questions. What they didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that this moment wasn't just a random outburst from a troubled passenger. This was part of something much bigger, something that Sarah herself didn't fully understand yet. But the man did. And as the plane continued its descent, as the ground drew closer, she could feel it in the pit of her stomach. This wasn't over. The plane touched down with a jolt, the runway rushing past as the wheels screeched against the asphalt. Outside, the flashing lights of emergency vehicles cut through the dim light of the early evening, and the passengers began to stir, relief and anxiety mixing in the air. But for Sarah, there was no relief, only a growing sense of dread. The authorities would be boarding soon. The man would be taken away, and this flight would be over. But the questions still lingered. Who was this man? Why had he been watching her? What had he planned to do if she hadn't intervened? And most importantly, what was still left to uncover? As the plane rolled to a stop, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. It was the flight attendant, her face kind but serious. "You did the right thing," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the noise of the disembarking passengers. "Whatever happens next, just remember that." But the words did little to comfort Sarah. She nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead, trying to prepare for whatever was coming next. She had done what she had to do, but deep down, she knew that this moment was just the beginning of something much larger, something that would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. As the plane came to a full stop, and the seatbelt signs flicked off with a low ding, the tension in the cabin seemed to tighten rather than release. Passengers sat frozen, some with wide, fearful eyes, others whispering in frantic, confused tones. The flight attendants were moving with a calm sense of urgency, but Sarah could tell from their clipped movements that they were on high alert. She sat motionless in her seat, her pulse thundering in her ears. The world around her seemed both hyperreal and distant, like she was watching everything through a thick pane of glass. She turned her gaze toward the front of the plane. Through the small window of the cockpit door, she could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles, their red and blue strobe lights illuminating the dark tarmac outside. The plane had landed in some remote part of an unfamiliar airport, far from the main terminals, where police cars and emergency personnel were already gathered. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry, as she imagined what was about to happen. Her mind was still whirling from the events that had just transpired. The man, the stranger who had been watching her, who had stared at her with such intensity, was still restrained in his seat. Even now, he seemed eerily calm, though his eyes never left her. It was as if he was waiting for something, still locked into some internal plan that she couldn't decipher. His presence, though subdued, loomed large in the cabin. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. The plane door opened with a sharp hiss, letting in a rush of cool evening air. Sarah's body tensed as uniformed officers began boarding the plane. They moved quickly, speaking in low voices with the flight crew, their expressions professional but grim. Sarah could see the glint of their badges in the dim cabin light as they scanned the passengers, their eyes immediately landing on the restrained man. They moved toward him with deliberate steps, flanking him from both sides, while one officer leaned in to speak to the flight attendants. Everything about the man was still unsettling. He was quiet now, his outburst from earlier replaced by an eerie calm. His hands were bound, and his face was expressionless, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something dark, something unfinished. Sarah felt a wave of nausea roll through her as she tried to understand what he had been planning. Had she been his target all along, or was she just caught up in something larger? The questions swirled in her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. The officer spoke to him quietly, but firmly, asking him questions that Sarah couldn't hear. The man didn't respond at first, simply staring straight ahead as if the officers weren't even there. It wasn't until one of them leaned in closer, speaking in a low, authoritative voice, that he finally blinked and turned his head slightly toward them. His lips moved, but whatever he said was too soft for anyone else to hear. Suddenly, the man's face twisted into a dark smile, a smile that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. It was a smile of defiance, of someone who knew something that no one else did. One of the officers stiffened at the sight of it, and without another word, they lifted the man to his feet and began to escort him off the plane. The cabin fell into a hushed silence as the passengers watched him being led away, his hands still bound, his movements slow and deliberate. Even as he was marched down the aisle, his eyes found Sarah again, locking onto her in a way that made her skin crawl. For a brief moment, time seemed to stretch out endlessly. Sarah couldn't look away, trapped by the intensity of his gaze. Then, as he was taken down the steps and into the waiting police car outside, something in the air shifted. A collective breath seemed to escape the cabin, and the tension that had gripped everyone for the last hour finally began to loosen. But for Sarah, the fear remained. She had expected to feel relief when he was taken away, but instead, she felt a gnawing sense of dread. What had he been planning? Why had he targeted her? The questions buzzed in her mind, but there were no answers, only the unsettling feeling that this wasn't truly over. The flight attendants began moving down the aisle, offering calm reassurances to the passengers, who were now free to disembark. People stood shakily, gathering their belongings, their faces pale and drawn. Sarah sat in her seat for a moment longer, trying to gather her thoughts. She knew that her life had just taken a turn. Something had shifted within her, and she wasn't sure how to deal with it yet. One of the flight attendants approached her, kneeling down beside her seat with a kind but serious expression. "You're all right?" she asked softly, though her eyes betrayed the gravity of the situation. Sarah nodded, but the words felt stuck in her throat. Was she all right? She didn't know anymore. "The police would like to ask you a few questions," the attendant said. "You don't have to worry. They just need some information, and then you'll be able to go." Sarah nodded again, her mind still struggling to catch up with everything that had happened. She stood on shaky legs, clutching her bag as she made her way to the front of the plane. The other passengers gave her a wide berth, their eyes filled with curiosity and concern. They had seen her signal, seen the moment when everything had changed, and now they were looking at her like she was someone else, someone who had played a part in something extraordinary. The cool air hit her face as she stepped off the plane, and she blinked against the bright lights of the emergency vehicles. Several police officers were waiting at the bottom of the stairs, and one of them stepped forward to greet her. He was tall, with a calm, reassuring demeanor, and he introduced himself as Officer Jacobs. His tone was gentle, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that told Sarah he wasn't just here to offer comfort. "We understand you were involved in an incident on the flight," he said, his voice steady. "Would you mind answering a few questions?" Sarah nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. She followed him to a quiet area near the edge of the tarmac, where they could speak privately. Another officer stood nearby, scribbling notes on a clipboard. The lights of the emergency vehicles cast long shadows across the ground, and the faint sounds of the airport echoed in the background. Officer Jacobs asked her to recount the events of the flight, what she had seen, what had made her flash the signal, and how the man had reacted. Sarah did her best to explain, though her voice felt shaky and unsure. She told him about the man's stare, the way he had watched her from the moment she boarded the plane. She explained how her gut had told her something was wrong, and how she had remembered the safety signal she had learned online. Jacobs listened intently, nodding at the right moments, but his expression remained unreadable. When she finished, he asked her a few follow-up questions, clarifying details about the man's behavior and her decision to act. Sarah answered as best she could, but the whole thing still felt surreal, like she was recounting something that had happened to someone else. "Do you know the man?" Jacobs asked, his tone casual, but Sarah could tell the question was anything but. "No," she replied quickly. "I've never seen him before today. I don't know who he is or why he was watching me." Jacobs scribbled something in his notebook, his brow furrowed slightly. He exchanged a glance with the other officer before turning back to Sarah. "We're still trying to gather more information, but it seems like your actions may have prevented something much worse from happening today." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The weight of his words hit her hard, and she felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Prevented something worse. What had that man been planning? Her mind flashed back to his cold, unblinking stare, the way his eyes had locked onto her like a predator stalking its prey. Do you think he was going to hurt someone?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacobs hesitated for a moment before answering. "We don't know for sure yet, but based on his behavior and the way he reacted to your signal, it's possible. We're looking into it." The officer's words hung heavy in the air. Sarah could feel the gravity of the situation settling in. She had acted on instinct, but now it seemed like she had been in more danger than she had realized. The man's actions, his gaze, his outburst, it all pointed to something far more sinister than she had initially thought. And the fact that she had been the one to intervene, to stop him, made her feel both powerful and deeply unsettled. As the officers wrapped up their questions, Jacobs gave her a reassuring nod. "You did the right thing," he said. "We'll take it from here." But as Sarah watched the flashing lights and the activity around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. There were too many unanswered questions, too many unknowns, and as much as she wanted to put this all behind her, to get back to her normal life, she knew that this experience would stay with her. She had made a choice, a life-altering decision in a moment of fear and instinct, and now she had to live with the consequences. But even as she walked away from the plane, the cold air biting at her skin, she couldn't help but feel like the man's shadow was still following her. As Sarah walked away from the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles and the bustle of the airport police, the weight of everything that had just happened pressed down on her. The adrenaline that had carried her through the ordeal was beginning to wear off, leaving her feeling hollow and shaky. She glanced back at the plane, now standing empty on the tarmac. The doors closed as the authorities continued to sweep through it. The man, the one who had watched her, who had been taken away in handcuffs, was out of sight now, but his presence still lingered in her mind like a dark cloud she couldn't shake. The airport staff guided her toward the terminal, where a small group of passengers, including herself, were being escorted to a private waiting area to be questioned further. She moved with the flow of people, her feet heavy, her mind in a haze. Everything felt surreal, as if she were floating through someone else's life, detached from the reality that had just unfolded. Inside the terminal, the passengers were ushered into a quiet room, far from the public areas of the airport. It was a stark, fluorescent-lit space with rows of plastic chairs, and everyone filed in silently. Some of the passengers looked shaken, their faces pale and tight with fear. Others were talking quietly to each other, trying to make sense of what had happened. But no one looked at Sarah. She could feel their curiosity, their unspoken questions, but no one approached her. She took a seat near the back of the room, grateful for the moment of solitude, even if it was only temporary. Her mind was still racing, playing over the events of the flight in slow motion. The man's eyes, the eerie smile he had flashed when the officers restrained him, the way he had seemed to fixate on her as if she were the key to some larger plan, none of it made sense. And the more she thought about it, the more unnerved she became. She didn't know him, didn't know what he wanted, but he had focused on her from the start. Her thoughts were interrupted when a police officer entered the room. He was younger than Officer Jacobs, with a serious, focused expression. He called out her name, and for a moment, Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. She stood up slowly, every eye in the room on her as she walked forward to meet the officer. He gestured for her to follow him into an adjoining room, where they could talk privately. The room was smaller, quieter, with just a table and 2 chairs. The officer introduced himself as Detective Hale, a member of the airport's security division. He asked her to sit down, and she did so, her nerves fraying at the edges. Hale was polite, but his demeanor told her that this was more than just a routine debriefing. There was something serious behind his calm, professional exterior, something that made Sarah's stomach churn with unease. "We've already spoken with the flight crew and reviewed the incident," Hale began, his voice low and measured. "Now, I just need to clarify a few details with you. We want to make sure we have the full picture of what happened." Sarah nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had already told Officer Jacobs everything, but she understood why they needed to ask her again. This wasn't just a minor disturbance. It was something much bigger. "Can you walk me through what happened one more time?" Hale asked, his eyes fixed on her intently. "From the moment you noticed the man watching you." Sarah took a deep breath and began to recount the story once more, starting with the moment she had boarded the plane and seen the man sitting across the aisle from her. She described the growing unease she had felt, the way he had watched her throughout the flight, his strange, unsettling stare that had made her skin crawl. She told Hale about the hand signal, how she had remembered it from an online forum, and how she had made the decision to use it when the man's behavior became too much to ignore. As she spoke, Hale listened carefully, his expression never changing. He jotted down a few notes, but mostly he just let her talk, letting her relive the details of the encounter. When she finished, he sat back in his chair, his brow furrowed slightly in thought. "And you're sure you've never seen this man before?" Hale asked. Sarah shook her head. "No, I've never seen him before today. I don't know who he is or why he was watching me." Hale was silent for a moment, tapping his pen against his notepad. Then he leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. "There's something you should know," he said. "We've done a preliminary background check on the man. His name is Victor Nash. He's not someone who's been on our radar before, but we found some concerning information." Sarah's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Hale hesitated for a moment, as if weighing how much to tell her. "Nash has been linked to a series of incidents involving harassment and intimidation. Nothing violent, at least not on record, but he has a history of targeting specific individuals, people he seems to fixate on for reasons that are unclear. There's a pattern to his behavior, though we're still piecing it together." Sarah's heart sank. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She had been targeted. She wasn't just a random passenger on that flight. Nash had chosen her, had focused on her from the moment she stepped on the plane. But why? What had drawn his attention to her? "We're still trying to figure out his motives," Hale continued, "but it's possible that he saw you before the flight, maybe at the airport or somewhere else, and decided to follow you. His behavior suggests that he's been planning something, though we don't know exactly what." Sarah's head spun with the weight of his words. She had been watched, followed, targeted by this man, and she hadn't even known it. The thought made her feel sick. She had spent the entire flight trying to convince herself that she was overreacting, that her instincts were wrong, but they hadn't been. Nash had been waiting for the right moment, watching her with those cold, calculating eyes. Hale's voice broke through her thoughts. "The good news is, you did exactly the right thing. Your quick thinking may have prevented something far worse from happening. Nash was likely building up to something, but you stopped him before he could act." Sarah nodded, though the knot of fear in her chest didn't loosen. She had acted, yes, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had only narrowly avoided something terrible. If she hadn't made that signal, if the flight attendant hadn't seen it, what would have happened? The possibilities were too horrifying to contemplate. "There's still a lot we don't know," Hale added. "Nash isn't talking yet, but we're confident that once we dig deeper, we'll get more answers. In the meantime, we'll make sure you're safe. We'll coordinate with local authorities to keep an eye on things, just as a precaution." Sarah's mind reeled. The idea of needing protection, of having the police watch over her, made everything feel even more surreal. This wasn't just a nightmare she could wake up from. This was her life now, a life that had been upended by a man she didn't even know. "Thank you," she said softly, though her voice sounded hollow to her own ears. She wasn't sure what else to say. The enormity of the situation was too much to grasp all at once. Hale nodded and stood up, signaling that the questioning was over for now. "We'll stay in touch," he said. "If anything changes, or if we learn more, we'll let you know right away." Sarah stood, her legs feeling weak beneath her. She left the room with Hale's words echoing in her mind, but no amount of reassurance could calm the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She had done the right thing, but the cost of that decision was far greater than she could have imagined. As she walked back through the terminal, surrounded by the ordinary chaos of airport life, Sarah felt like she was moving through a different world. Everything had changed in the span of a few hours. She had gone from being an anonymous traveler to someone who had been caught in the crosshairs of a dangerous man. And now, even though Nash was in custody, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being watched, that something was still lurking just beyond the edges of her understanding. She made her way to the exit, stepping out into the cool night air. The world outside felt too big, too open, too uncertain. And as she stood there, her heart still racing, she couldn't help but wonder what would come next. Would she ever feel safe again? Would she ever be able to board a plane without looking over her shoulder? The thought lingered in her mind as she hailed a cab and gave the driver her address. She leaned back in the seat, staring out the window at the city lights passing by. But her thoughts were far away. The man's eyes, his twisted smile, they were burned into her memory now, a reminder of how close she had come to something dark and dangerous. She had made a life-altering decision in the air, one that had saved her from whatever Nash had planned. But the aftermath of that decision was only just beginning to unfold. And as she sat in the back of the cab, the question that haunted her most was whether she had truly escaped his grasp, or if this was only the beginning of something much darker. The cab ride home felt like it took hours, though Sarah knew it had only been about 20 minutes. As she sat in the back seat, staring blankly at the passing city lights, her mind was a swirl of fragmented thoughts and emotions. She couldn't shake the feeling that even though Victor Nash was now in custody, the danger wasn't truly over. There was a nagging voice in the back of her head, whispering that something darker, something unfinished, still lingered in the air. Every shadow the cab passed, every flash of light from street lamps and passing cars, made her stomach twist with unease. When the cab finally pulled up outside her apartment, she fumbled to pay the driver, her hands still trembling slightly. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, seemed to notice her unease, but he didn't say anything. Sarah was grateful for that. She didn't have the energy to explain, and even if she did, how could she possibly convey the sheer terror of what she had just experienced? Stepping out of the cab, Sarah pulled her coat tighter around herself as the cool night air swept over her. The familiar sight of her apartment building should have been a comfort, but tonight it felt different. The tall, imposing structure loomed over her, casting long shadows on the street below. Normally, this place was her sanctuary, her escape from the world. But now it felt vulnerable, exposed. She felt exposed. She climbed the stairs to her floor, her footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. Her mind was racing, replaying every moment from the plane, every decision she had made. She still wasn't sure how she had found the courage to make that signal, to act when everything inside her was screaming to stay quiet, to stay hidden. But the man's eyes had left her no choice. There had been something in them, something cold and calculating, that told her waiting would have been far more dangerous. Inside her apartment, the silence was suffocating. The familiar hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, all felt distant, like she was hearing them from underwater. She dropped her bag on the floor and collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. For a moment, she just sat there, trying to ground herself, to breathe, but her chest felt tight, her heart still racing. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her spiraling thoughts. She pulled it out and saw a message from her sister, asking if she had landed safely. Sarah hesitated, unsure of how to respond. How could she explain what had just happened? How could she tell her sister that, yes, she was safe, physically, at least, but that her world had just been turned upside down? She quickly typed back a vague reply. Landed safely. Long day. I'll call you tomorrow. She put the phone down on the coffee table and stared at it for a long moment. Part of her wanted to talk to someone, to hear a familiar voice, but another part of her was too exhausted to relive the details. Talking about it would make it more real, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for that yet. Hours passed in a blur. At some point, Sarah had moved from the couch to her bed, though she wasn't sure how much time had passed. Sleep was elusive, her mind refusing to shut down, replaying every moment from the flight. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw Nash's face, his eerie smile, his piercing gaze. She tossed and turned, her body aching with exhaustion, but her thoughts wouldn't let her rest. She kept thinking about what Hale had said, about Nash's history of harassment, his pattern of fixating on certain individuals. Had she been just another random target, or was there something more sinister behind his obsession with her? It wasn't until the early hours of the morning, when the sky outside her window was just beginning to lighten, that she finally drifted into a restless sleep. But even then, her dreams were haunted. In her mind, she was back on the plane, sitting in her seat, but this time she couldn't move. Her limbs were frozen, and Nash was there, standing over her, his cold eyes watching her every move. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but no sound came. She could only sit there, helpless, as he leaned closer, his lips curling into that same chilling smile. When Sarah woke, the sun was already high in the sky, casting a harsh light across her apartment. For a moment, she didn't move. She stared at the ceiling, trying to shake off the lingering unease from her dreams. Her body felt heavy, weighed down by exhaustion and dread. But she knew she couldn't stay in bed forever. She had to face the day, face the reality of what had happened. She dragged herself out of bed and into the shower, hoping the hot water would wash away the fear that clung to her like a second skin. But even as the steam filled the bathroom, the tension in her chest didn't ease. She kept thinking about Nash, about what he had planned. The authorities still didn't know, and that was the part that scared her the most. Hale had said they were looking into his background, trying to piece together his motives, but Sarah couldn't help but feel like she was missing something important, some crucial detail that would make everything make sense. By the time she was dressed and sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Officer Jacobs. Her heart skipped a beat as she answered, bracing herself for whatever news he had to share. "Sarah, it's Jacobs," the officer said, his voice steady but with an underlying seriousness. "I wanted to give you an update. We've been digging deeper into Nash's history, and we've uncovered some things that you should be aware of." Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. "What kind of things?" "We've found evidence that Nash has been involved in a number of online groups, communities where individuals with dangerous ideologies gather. He's been active on message boards, sharing plans and discussing potential targets. We believe that his fixation on you wasn't random. It seems like he had been planning something for some time, though we're still trying to figure out exactly what." A cold wave of fear washed over Sarah. "So he knew who I was before the flight." "It looks that way," Jacobs replied, his voice grim. "He's been following you online, tracking your social media, reading your posts. We think he may have seen something that made him fixate on you. It's still unclear why he chose you specifically, but this wasn't a chance encounter." Sarah's mind reeled. The idea that Nash had been watching her, stalking her online, long before the flight was terrifying. She had always been cautious about what she shared online, but now it felt like nothing had been private, like Nash had been lurking in the shadows of her life for weeks or even months. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The fear in her chest felt suffocating. "We're taking this very seriously," Jacobs assured her. "We're working with cybercrime units to track Nash's online activity, and we'll be placing officers near your home for added protection. We don't believe there's an immediate threat now that Nash is in custody, but we want to be sure. We're also advising you to tighten your online security, change passwords, lock down your social media accounts. And if you notice anything unusual, anything at all, let us know immediately." Sarah nodded, though she knew Jacobs couldn't see her. "Okay," she said quietly. "Thank you." After the call ended, Sarah sat in stunned silence, her coffee growing cold in her hands. The knowledge that Nash had been stalking her online, that he had chosen her for some unknown reason, made her skin crawl. She had always considered herself cautious, careful about her privacy, but it hadn't been enough. Somehow, Nash had found her, and even though he was now behind bars, the thought that there could be others like him, watching from the shadows, made her feel exposed and vulnerable in a way she had never experienced before. The day passed in a blur. Sarah took Jacobs' advice, locking down her online presence, deleting old posts, changing passwords. Each action felt like a small step toward reclaiming her sense of security, but it wasn't enough. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, lingered like a dark cloud that followed her wherever she went. As night fell, The unease in her chest grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that, even though Nash was in custody, the danger wasn't truly over. There was something unresolved, something still lurking out there, waiting. She thought about the online communities Jacobs had mentioned, the dangerous ideologies Nash had been a part of. What if there were others? What if Nash wasn't acting alone? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She sat on her couch, staring at the flickering light of the television, but not really watching it. Her mind was elsewhere, lost in the dark possibilities that haunted her. The man on the plane had been just one part of a larger, more terrifying puzzle. And though she had stopped him, the ripple effects of that encounter were far from over. As the hours ticked by, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what the future held. She had made a life-altering decision on that plane, one that had saved her from whatever Nash had planned. But the aftermath of that decision was only just beginning to unfold. The questions, the fear, the uncertainty, it all loomed large, casting a shadow over her life that she wasn't sure would ever